The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a young teen in Florida. Jason Tuss was your average American teen looking for adventure. He was a part of the wrestling team, an honor student, and even working on his associate's degree in order to become a lawyer by the age of 23. So what kind of adventure did this 17-year-old boy find? Well, in February, in his senior year, he decided to pick up the alluring sport of scuba diving. In July of 1987, Jason was planning a diving trip to the Gulf of Mexico that unfortunately got canceled due to bad weather. So because of this, Jason would ask his father for permission to go diving in a small springs in Jenkins Creek so he could help a friend look for a diving knife that he had lost earlier. This cave inside Jenkins Creek, though, was no ordinary cave, and in fact, was considered a difficult and complex dive to the locals in the area, due to the complexity of the system itself and the major buildup of soot and dirt. Not knowing this though, his father would say yes, and on July 21st, 1987, at about 10 a.m., Jason and his two friends, Benson Cusmano and Christopher Schwartz, would arrive at the springs. As soon as they got there, the boys got everything ready, and Benson and Jason dove into the springs, while Christopher stayed up top for support. The boys had only become dive certified only 5 months prior to this, and Jason was the most experienced of his friends, with 100 dives since February. Though, did you notice what I just said? They were only scuba diving certified, not cave diving certified, which meant they still lacked a massive amount of knowledge to even penetrate the cave itself, though this did not stop them from at least trying the dive anyway. Fortunately though, they still remembered to bring simple things with them, such as a guideline to help prevent themselves from getting lost. Benson would be the one to lead the dive, which also meant that he would be the one to lay the guideline as well. And so as the two swam deeper and deeper, taking in all the sights of the cave, behind them something terrible was happening. Unfortunately, the boys' flippers were kicking up so much silt and sediment that as soon as they stopped to look behind them, they were already surrounded in dark, making it almost impossible to even see their hands in front of their own faces. And not before long, both started to panic as both of their visibilities went down to a complete zero, even making their flashlights almost to an obsolete. As Benson was panicking, he would follow the guideline back to the entrance. Unfortunately though, not thinking clearly, he would bring the guideline with him, meaning Jason was now lost inside the labyrinth-like cave system. Benson, not wanting to leave his friend though, would then try to descend back inside the cave. But even with the line, he still wasn't comfortable enough with the visibility at zero, and he got too scared and turned around. Christopher and Benson would then run to their local dive shop to get help, along with calling 911 as soon as they got to the store. Deputies then raced over to Jason's parents' house to let them know that he had been in a diving accident. Though because his father was bound to a wheelchair, his mother had to go to the springs alone to see if it was actually him. Immediately after, two anonymous expert divers would then show up who were at the dive shop, ready to find the teen. They dove in, and about 57 feet or 17 meters into the system, they were greeted by a very grisly sight. Turns out that without the guideline, Jason became incredibly lost after kicking up the massive amounts of dirt and soot. He would then wander around the maze-like system until he eventually lost all hope. He would then pick a spot and sit down. He would then take his tank off and grab the knife that he brought out and carved a message into the side of it for his family. It would then read, "I love you, Mom, Dad, and Christian." It was then believed that he intentionally drowned himself, knowing that there was no hope of finding the exit. When the rescue divers finally found him, his mask was pulled down around his neck. He was wearing his weighted belt and only had one single fin still on. His scuba tank was also only 20 feet or 6 meters away from him, with the message carved into it and also several minutes worth of air still in it. Unfortunately, Jason's mother would receive this news on her birthday. The family still holds a piece of the cake in the freezer to remember along with the tank itself. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Jason's shoes? Or better yet, would you have even been crazy enough to be in Jason's shoes? The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell 3 cave divers in Florida. 3 best friends wanted to take a break from college. Kenneth DeGrazia, Michael Williams, and Robert Grayer all loved going on adventures, so one day they decided it would be a great idea to go cave diving. And so they thought to themselves, what better place to go than Florida? They decided they would go to a place called Little River Springs, which itself is located on the Suwannee River in the middle of a wildlife park, about an hour northwest of Gainesville, Florida. The springs itself is about 150 feet or 45.7 meters long, with a cave system that stretches for about 1,200 feet or 365 meters. The cave is mainly just one long tunnel with a few corridors that lead off to nowhere. The deeper you go into the cave though, the deadlier it becomes, as both the cave walls and floors suddenly are covered with a thick layer of dirt and silt. Looking at the cave, you wouldn't think many would take the risk and venture too deep inside, thus making it an easy diving experience, especially with the cave itself being just one long tunnel. But in reality, the Springs is a killer and has been home to dozens of deaths throughout the years. So much so that he was even closed for 2 years due to the amount of deaths. But after the ownership changed hands, it was reopened. Which now brings us back to our story. On August 28, 1972, after making the 15-hour drive from New Jersey, Kenneth, Michael, and Robert would all walk past the warning signs posted all along the trees and head for the springs. Once they got there, they had all the equipment that they would need for the dive except 2 crucial things: backup tanks just in case they ran out of air unexpectedly, and guidelines just in case they got lost. Though not thinking that it would be a problem, they dove in and descended down. As they were swimming down, everything was going according to plan, and so they were taking advantage of where they were and taking in all the sights of the cave had to offer. And by the time they got near the more difficult parts of the cave that were covered in layers of silt, they made sure to turn around and head back towards the entrance. As they were swimming back though, they started to realize that their gauges were reading dangerously too low for comfort. So just now realizing their mistake of not bringing extra tanks, they began to panic a bit and swim faster and faster towards the entrance. Unfortunately though, by the time they were only about 50 feet or 15 meters from the cave entrance, that was when the men were confronted with their worst nightmare. As Kenneth and Robert's breathing started to sputter out until there was totally nothing left to breathe. Now both in a life-threatening panic, began to thrash around and pray for air that just isn't there. Michael, wanting to do something, swam over to try to help, but because he was in such a panicked state by this time, Robert started to overpower Michael in a bid to take his regulator. Starting to feel the burning in his own lungs and not wanting to drown himself, Michael chose to take out his diving knife and stab Robert in his abdomen in an attempt to save his own life. Unfortunately though, because of the struggle itself, Michael had also drowned along with his friends. All 3 men were just mere feet away from the entrance. Luckily for the 3 though, the park and springs are a heavy tourist destination, and so it wasn't long that people found their vehicles parked out front for several hours too long and called the local sheriff's department, who were then able to get a recovery party together led by rescue diver Tom Mount, who was luckily in town from Miami at the time of the accident. When the team got to the springs, they didn't waste much time and dove right in. And as expected, they were able to find the bodies pretty quickly, with one of the first things them noticing was that Michael's tank still had minutes worth of air still in it, at least 350 psi still showing on the gauge. But the other 2's tanks were bone dry. They also found Robert only 15 feet or 4.5 meters from the entrance, along with his stab wound to his stomach. Michael's body was found 45 feet or 13 meters further in, and Kenneth was found 10 feet further back than that. Today, the springs remains open as a popular tourist attraction, though always poses the constant threat of death right under all these happy faces. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were almost out of air and your friends were right there with just a little bit left? Would you have attacked them just for a breath? The film in which you are about to see is an account of 2 men's night in a rather irregular cave. In October of 1986, David Gerard, a staff writer, and Bill Wilson, a staff photographer, both working for a small newspaper in Tennessee, were planning to get to the truth of one of Tennessee's most infamous cave systems, the Bell Witch Cave. The cave itself is a fairly average cave system. Nothing too special. It's approximately 490 feet or 149 meters long. It's also privately owned, and in 1986 was owned by the Eden family, and is located in Adams, Tennessee, which is about 45 minutes from Fort Campbell and about 44 minutes from Nashville. It's actually the history behind the cave that makes it rather off. You see, in 1804, John Bell would decide to move from North Carolina to the 320-acre farm that resides over the cave. For more than a decade, he lived in relative peace. That was until the summer of 1817. According to legend, they began to see strange-looking animals walking around the farm occasionally, and would start to hear knocking on the doors and walls at night. On top of that, they would also hear rats chewing on their bedposts at night, but with no signs of gnawing the next morning. Chains dragging around the house, the sounds of huge stones dropping all around them, and weird gulping and choking sounds coming at night. Eventually, whatever it was that was tormenting them showed itself. Apparently, it was a witch named Kate Bates who used to live in the area. After revealing herself, the ghost would torment the family for the next 3 years. Mainly John Bell and his daughter, Betsy Bell. She would usually torture them by pinching, scratching them, sticking them with sewing needles, and even going as far as beating them. Eventually, John Bell would pass away in 1820 from a suspected poisoning, though no test could have been performed to tell for sure at the time. After John Bell's death, it was revealed that Kate Bates was actually once John Bell's girlfriend. And early in the 19th century, they were actually engaged to be married. Their plans were ruined, and engagements were later broken off. John would later marry a woman named Lucy. Kate would find out and become furious. She would then desperately try to break them up. After a couple of years of Kate trying to break them up, John would become tired of this and snap. It was said that he knocked her out and would bring her down to his basement, where he would then starve her to death and bury her body inside the cave system. After this, the family would eventually move away from the farm, which would then switch hands multiple times until it found its way into the Eden family. In October of 1986, the two journalists David Gerard and Bill Wilson decided they would spend the night to prove the legends wrong, and finally be able to lay this story to rest forever. They started the day by attending a guided tour of the cave. Nothing too eventful, just the owners mainly telling ghost stories about the cave from decades past. Even David remembers thinking to himself how uneventful and boring this tour actually was. Though as soon as the tour was over, they had received permission from the owners that they could spend the night. And although they were warned that not even them as owners would dare go into the cave by themselves, let alone at night. However, undaunted, they wished them luck and went on their ways. They weren't fazed at all though. After all, the cave itself wasn't really that intimidating at all. And truth be told, they didn't believe in ghosts nor had a reason to fear them at all. And remembered telling each other, big deal, and it's just a grunge hole anyway. They were in the first of 2 rooms, or a large opening within the cave. This is where they would sleep for the night, and although this area was well lit by overhead lights, it was also in a very peculiar place. You see, the cave may have also been an Indian burial ground, because where they were sleeping used to be an empty child's grave as well. As the two started setting up their sleeping bags and equipment for the night, Bill would start looking around and would say, "You know, it's not the witch in this cave that scares me the most. Do you know what a brown recluse spider looks like?" As he said this, his flashlight started to pan around the room to a pitted rock wall on the far side of the room. It was covered from top to bottom in deadly spiders, including one the size of a $50. There were so many we couldn't even count them all, they said. It would then be at this time that they would hear their first noise. It wasn't loud at first, it just caught them off guard, as it was just a new sound in a relatively quiet cave. They weren't exactly sure what they just heard, but they were sure that it just came from the second room, just a few feet behind them. The two would then slowly walk towards the second room. Although it was pitch dark, they would slowly peer into the room to see if they could hear the noise again. Just then, the noise came again, only this time it was louder. A raspy, deep sound like an unwavering groan or deep electric buzzer with a weak battery, which lasted around 5 seconds. It was then followed by several loud, deep thumps. "Did you hear that?" David would ask Bill. "I have never heard a noise like that in a cave before in my life," exclaimed Bill. And Bill was no stranger to caves, as he was also a member of the National Speleological Society and had explored miles of cave systems of all shapes and sizes located in Tennessee and Alabama. So he was usually rather comfortable in caves and usually felt right at home. This, though, he said, made him feel immediately uneasy, as this was no cave noise he had ever heard before. Just then, there was a third growl-like sound that pierced the cave. Only this time, it was worse, even louder than before, even to the point where it overpowered their own voices, and sounded like it was now coming right from around the corner. "Let's go," Bill yelled out. They went to the gate about 20 yards away and decided to look back inside the cave. They both had a feeling of being watched, someone just staring daggers at them. They would then sit there trying to rationalize what had actually happened, trying to come up with an explanation. They would look around the cave to see if anyone was actually outside making the noises, but all they saw were fireflies and darkness. They then looked around to see if anyone could have snuck into another entrance in order to make the sound. Maybe ran back out, but there were no other entrances to the cave. Maybe it was loudspeakers then. Maybe there were loudspeakers set up in the second room making the noise somehow. After all, this was a spooky tourist destination. One would think they would have something set up to make the ambiance a little spooky, one might think. Though they had remembered that earlier the owner had told them that they didn't have to have any setup. He also went on to say that most likely sound systems and wires and setups like that would most likely be discovered by tourists exploring the cave anyhow, so there was no point. Bill would then say, "But caves don't just growl though, so what was it then?" They then went back inside the cave to search for some wire that might lead to some loudspeakers. And as you can see, they were actually able to find some electrical wires that ran into the inside of the cave. The wires, though, were connected directly into the lights that were strung overhead. They then searched as thoroughly as they could to try to come up with a source, but they came up with nothing. The cave fell silent once more. They were then contemplating just going home and saying the brown recluse spiders were enough to just say no, as one could almost certainly bite them and send them straight to the hospital. But they decided to stay just a little longer. After all, it could have just been their imaginations from hearing all the ghost stories all day leading up to this. They decided to sit quietly in the first room, away from the spider wall, and waited to see if anything else would happen. For about 15 minutes, they heard nothing but the dripping of water coming from deeper inside the cave. Then suddenly, they heard a faint rumbling sound, almost like a thunder coming from the front gate. So they decided to head up there to investigate it. "It's probably just a jet overhead," Bill said, as they walked closer to the entrance. As they reached the gate, a loud, powerful screech hit them from the back of the cave. But the sound wasn't metallic or just a howl of the wind. It was clearly vocal and high-pitched. They quickly looked at each other and left the ground as quickly as possible. When they told their editor the next day, he would explain, "Are you crazy? You ran off by noises? You had a Pulitzer Prize winning story if you could have proven that there were actually ghosts. You should have stayed there and interviewed her." Wanting to let the cave and to a lesser extent their editor have the last laugh, David would drive back to the cave the following Tuesday to see about staying another night there. When he got back to the farm though, he stayed in his car to talk to the owner with his motor still running. During the conversation, David asked the owner, was there anything else that was weird that occurred other than the strange noises? The owner would go on to say, "Well, a lot of people come here and can't leave right away. They'll try to start their car or truck, but nothing will happen, not even a click. And it doesn't even matter how new or old the car or truck is. It happens to them all. It usually takes hours before the cars start back up again, and when they do, they sound like nothing ever happened to them. The mechanics that come up here can't even help and figure out what's going on." As he was telling David about the cars, just a little white steam started to come from David's 1986 Renault, which was brand new at the time. He had turned it off and later would only need a quart of water to top it off from overheating again. What do you guys think? Do you think the Bell Witch Cave is actually haunted? Or do you think there's more to the story than meets the eye? The film which you are about to see is an account of the disaster which befell 3 experienced cave divers in Florida. Originally from North Carolina, diving instructor Brian Safford had been diving for the past 28 years and was usually quite comfortable diving in conditions that would leave an average man quite terrified, mainly dealing in horrible blacked out conditions or even directly in icy water. So one weekend in 2016, Brian and 2 of his friends decided to take an adventurous diving weekend to a dive spot located in Genie Springs in Blue Grotto. They then woke up that Sunday morning, checked out of the cabin that they were renting for the weekend, all the while discussing maybe hitting up one more spot. just for the fun of it, a pretty harmless dive spot known as Troy Springs. The springs itself is about 70 feet or 21 meters deep and contains the remains of a 19th century steamboat Madison at the bottom. The ship was purposely sunk during the Civil War to avoid capture by Union troops. So in other words, it's a pretty great location to get some diving in. When the group arrived at Troy Springs, they walked down to the water to check out the visibility, and one of Brian's friends took the opportunity to let the rest of them know that he had recently been here and made sure to let them know that there were several overhangs, no actual real system that they could go into. There was also an open water class being conducted as well as a freediving class. So at the very least they knew that it was safe to swim, even though that visibility was only 6 to 10 feet down. As they were floating on the surface, they would take the opportunity to do their equipment checks and to make sure everyone was ready. Though unfortunately, their dive was flawed from the very beginning. As all the way up to this point, Brian was diving with a Still 100 tank with a backup 30 cubic foot pony tank for safety and backup, but for some reason on this dive, he only brought an aluminum 63 tank. And his friends would essentially end up making the exact same mistake by bringing cheaper tanks for the dive. And on top of that, they decided not to bring any backup equipment. And even more insane than that, one of his friends decided to only dive with half a full tank, thinking that they would be fine in such an easy dive. At first though, they only dove down to about the 20 feet or 6 meter mark where they performed their bubble checks. It would also be at this point that they noticed that their visibility wasn't really 6 to 10 feet, and really it was more like 3 feet in every direction, making their trip a lot more dangerous than previously thought, but still manageable, so they continued on. Then as they made it to about the 30-foot mark, Brian and one of the other divers signaled okay to each other, but unfortunately both noticed that they couldn't find the third diver. That's when they both decided to do what's known as a lost buddy procedure, where they both search for about a minute and then come to the surface for air. Unfortunately though, during the search, Brian would end up losing his second friend in the blackout conditions. And by this time, he had already descended about 45 to 50 feet into the springs. And as you can see by the footage, forget 3 feet, he could barely even see 2 inches in front of his own face. So Brian thought to himself, at the very least, he knew that they had been underwater for at least 4 minutes by this time. Then trying to stay calm and collected, Brian then started to swim in small circles in order to look for his friends. So after a minute was up of searching, he thought it was about time to resurface. So he started swimming in the direction that he thought was up, but before he knew it, a wall appeared right in front of him. Then his manifold ended up hitting the ceiling. And with that, Brian now has realized that he has now entrapped himself in a cavern of some kind. Understanding his situation, and with only a few inches of visibility around him, he began to breathe quickly and overthink a little. But luckily, that's when Brian's training started to kick in, and he started to think to himself, don't panic. You have plenty of air. The dive just started. He then kept calm and began to back kick from the location that he was at. And as he began to kick, he could start to see the wall in front of him and the overhang above him start to recede into the murky water, which was reassuring him that he was going in the right direction. He did this for about 10 feet or 3 meters until he started to notice the ambient light overhead start to get brighter and brighter, letting him know that he was no longer trapped in the cavern anymore. Brian then began his swim back to the surface, but suddenly realized that he was ascending too fast. Turned out he inadvertently swam up too fast, and his wing and dry suit had taken on more air than he wanted. So he had to decide immediately to flare his body as such so he could dump all the excess air. He also tried opening the dump valve on his suit, but it was already fully open at this point. Luckily though, he was able to get it back under control at about the 10-foot mark. That's when he decided to look at his computer and realized that he hadn't even dove past the 60-foot or 18-meter mark. So that's when Brian decided to make the decision to forego his last safety stop and hurry up to the surface as soon as possible. Unfortunately for them, by the time he already resurfaced, both of his friends were already waiting for him. And if anything, Brian learned that day never to lose himself in complacency when you are about to dive inside the earth again. Let this story be a cautionary tale to anyone who ever wants to dive inside of the earth anytime soon. The film in which you are about to see is an account of the disaster in which befell an exhausted spelunker. In 1965, Jim Cowling and 2 of his friends wanted to have some fun to get away from the stressful life of going to college. But instead of going to the beach or a far-off place like most other college students, they decided to have the bright idea of traversing the very difficult cave system known as Neves Cave. Located only 11 minutes from Salt Lake City, Neves Cave is a very dangerous cave. Though being that this was 1965 and the cave itself had only been discovered 20 years prior, there wasn't much knowledge to exactly how dangerous this cave actually was. And only the most experienced spelunkers should ever try to have traversed it. And that is because unlike most caves on this channel that are filled with glorious galleries that usually get our spelunkers lost, in Neves Caves, there are no spectacular draperies, stalactites, stalagmites, popcorn formations, or anything else that makes it spectacular, or a popular tourist attraction for that matter. And on top of that, it's also icy and cold, with constantly dripping walls and ceilings with slimy floors that have a weird water and mud mix. Sounds like the perfect getaway from the stresses of college life, doesn't it? Neves Cave at one point was even considered to be the US's deepest cave. This was, although a very long time ago, as nowadays it's ranked about number 15th in the nation. Though since many at the time did think that this was the deepest cave, many tried to map it and traverse it. Or like Jim Cowley and his friends, wanted to see how fast they could get to the bottom and back up top again, just for the fun of the sport. So during the Memorial Day weekend break, Jim and his friends would begin their trip to the cave system. This wasn't their first exploration of a cave system though. It was most likely their first encounter with this advance of a system, though having a little common sense, they knew what they were most likely in for and brought all the right equipment that they would need. The three began their descent as soon as possible, and the descent down was a lot easier than they were expecting, so they were actually enjoying themselves, taking in what little sights there were to be had, and were even taking pictures when they could. Though as anyone who's ever explored in a system that requires climbing rope will tell you, the descent is always easier than the trek back to the entrance up top. So when they decided to turn back midway, mainly due to the fact that only half of the cave was actually mapped at this time, his two friends would start climbing in the front, while Cowley was climbing near the back. He would suddenly and out of nowhere receive one of the most massive flows of lactic acid of his life inside of his arms, resulting in immediate exhaustion near the top of the sheer ledge. He would then let out a cry to let his friends know that he was in trouble. Unfortunately, they were already pretty ahead of him by this time, and because of the slipperiness of the cave walls, Cowling would have to wait 8 hours dangling before his friends could actually work their way down to help him. And because they knew that they would have to maneuver him through some rather restricting passageways in order to get him all the way out of the cave, they would decide to lower him to another ledge. That way he would at least be able to rest while they went back into town to get some help. When the police found out, they were able to assemble about 40 Salt Lake County deputy sheriffs and some of the best local cave explorers as fast as they could, as they all knew that he could easily die from hypothermia if left in the dark, dank cave system for too long. And because the cave is located on the north side of Mount Olympus, the team decided to set up base camp at the bottom of the mountain and used four-wheel vehicles to get rescuers as close to the cave as possible. Among one of the rescuers, they decided to bring a physician along in order to administer a tranquilizer in order to maneuver Cowling through the narrow passageways, which were also lined with sharp, jagged rocks. Unfortunately though, since many of the rescue team had never been in the cave system, they were fully unprepared for the trip, and the constant dripping of water in 40-degree darkness made it a miserable, muddy challenge, taking them several hours to even descend down to Cowling. When the team made it about 600 feet, or 182 meters, they were finally able to reach Cowling, who at this point was lying unconscious and in critical condition from the elements. Luckily though, his friends left him in a sleeping bag, which the rescuers decided to keep him in, making it easier to carry him back up to the top. He would then be rushed to the local hospital. Altogether, Jim Cowling would spend 36 hours in total underground, mostly by himself in the dark. A few days later, a Desert News staff writer would find Cowling to get his take on the situation. Cowling would then answer, "It isn't a sightseeing cave. It's the kind of cave you want to go and see if you can make it all the way to the bottom and come back out again," as he would finish by saying that he was far from done from spelunking and couldn't wait to get back out there. The Neves Cave system was later closed to the public by the United States Forest Service, and later in 1977 was made into a national natural landmark. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if you were in Jim Cowley's position and all of a sudden found yourself with total muscle failure at the bottom of a very deep cave. The film which you are about to see is an account of the disaster which befell 5 cave explorers in Alabama. Originally from Tallahassee, Florida, best friends Tom Harris and Paul Leahy loved to go spelunking on their spare time. So when they were both lucky enough to have a free weekend together, they decided to make the 6-hour drive north to a system known as Moses Tomb Cave, which itself is located in DeSoto State Park, which is about an hour and 30 minutes from Birmingham, Alabama. The cave system itself is surrounded by a thick forest on the side of a small mountain known as Fox Mountain. Once you locate the cave itself though, you might notice that the entrance is an unassuming hole that runs about 2 feet by 4 feet, or 60.9 centimeters by 1 meter long. A nearby tree is also normally used as a primary rigging point to give the people descending down more safety. Once you squeeze past the entrance, the cave opens up into a 15-foot or 4.5 meter sheer drop into a room that's about 40 feet or 12 meters in diameter. Offset to this, about 5 feet or 1.5 meters, is then a large hole that leads to a 230-foot or 70-meter freefall that's about 40 feet or 12 meters in diameter also. Essentially, if you aren't ready to do some climbing, you might find out why they call this cave a tomb, which now brings us back to our story. The 2 friends Tom and Paul were also planning on meeting up with 3 other friends from the local area who also loved to go cave exploring. Amongst them were Pat Lancaster, Art Gala, and Howard Cobb. When the 5 friends finally met up at Moses Tomb, their plan was to do what's called bouncing the pit, where you just rappel all the way down to the bottom and simply climb back up. Sounds easy enough, would you agree? Well, on October 28, 1990, the 5 men made their way through the forest, and thanks to the signs posted along the trees, were able to find the incredibly small entrance. And as soon as they got there, they began to prepare for their descent down. They started by preparing the rappel rope inside the cave and by helping each other get outfitted with the proper equipment to efficiently rappel and equally climb back out again. Tom was planning on leading the descent, but at the last minute started having light problems. So they decided to let Howard lead the way. He was a little nervous though, as this would only be the 3rd time he's actually rappelled into any cave. So determined and brave, he straps on his harness and starts to squeeze through the entrance. As he was rappelling down, he was doing pretty good, but then began to notice that not even his large headlamp was bright enough to light up the entire sheer drop. And so for most of the descent, he was just descending into pure darkness, though still being able to see at least his hand in front of his face thanks to his headlamp. Though luckily he was able to find the offset corridor and nothing happened, he was then able to reach the bottom and give an all clear to his friends back up top. Once they were all ready, Tom then hooked his harness to the rope and began his rappel down as well. As he was beginning his descent down, everything was going to plan, but then all of a sudden, after he hit the offset corridor, Tom's harness snapped, and without warning, he fell about 100 feet or 30 meters to the cave floor. Luckily though, he wasn't dead, so he gathered up enough strength and yelled out for help. Just then though, without hesitation, Howard ran over to him to make sure he was okay, and to continue yelling out for help so Tom didn't have to. Meanwhile, back up top, the last 3 friends knew something bad had just happened, but weren't sure exactly what it was. And so Pat and Paul ran back to the cars and drove back to the nearest town to get some help, while Art stayed behind making sure that they didn't need any extra help. Just then, Tom's speech started to sputter, and he started to have small back-to-back seizures. So Art made the decision to also descend into the cave to see if he could do anything else to help. Though luckily, as soon as he made it down, Tom began to regain consciousness. And so when he made it down, Art and Howard began to look at Tom more thoroughly together and found out that Tom had a fractured left leg. On top of that, he was also complaining on the fact that both of his legs were now numb and he couldn't feel them. Which now meant, unfortunately, Tom really was stuck at the bottom of this cavernous pit. Luckily though, he still has friends around him, and so Howard would tear a piece of his shirt off in order to stop the bleeding coming from both his legs and back. Meanwhile, Pat and Paul were finally able to reach the nearest telephone, which was a long 15-minute drive to the nearest truck stop. They were then able to make the call to the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department at around 11:40 a.m., which then immediately dispatched their local rescue squad to the scene. A local cave rescueman by the name of Ricky Little was also called to the scene to see if he could help any. The dispatcher even went as far as calling in the Chattanooga-Hamilton County Cave Rescue Team to see if they could help any as well, but unfortunately their station was some 50 miles or 80 kilometers away, so they would have to get there when they got there. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Tom started to complain about not being able to feel his legs again, which he says while shivering and shaking. Luckily for him though, the first rescue personnel are starting to show up and set up outside the pit, though unfortunately they still don't have the right equipment to repel such a deep pit and rescue him, so they have to helplessly wait on more help to come. After about 30 minutes though, the correct equipment arrived and everyone was able to get ready to save Tom. By this time though, 2 hours had already passed since the accident, so Tom's condition was starting to worsen as time went on. So that's when a paramedic by the name of Anthony Clifton decided he'd be the first one to rappel down. That way, he could provide aid as more help made its way inside the cave. When Anthony was able to finally make his way down, he began to assess the scene at hand and noticed Tom wasn't talking anymore and had the general appearance of someone being in shock. There was also a considerable amount of blood on the surrounding rocks, and he was also very pale in color, with a very rapid pulse. So Anthony began to help him as fast as he could. Meanwhile, back up top nearby, a man by the name of Jerry Smith, who just so happens to be an expert in rope rescue, was nearby teaching a class. They heard about the situation and decided to head on over to see if they could help. And lucky enough, Jerry's class were then able to rig up the mechanical advantage system needed to haul up the stretcher in less than 30 minutes, and it was on its way down. Paul then decided to rappel down as well in order to get better communication tools to Anthony. That way he would be able to talk to his peers on the top a lot better. As soon as Paul got to the bottom, they also began to lift Tom onto the backboard and tried their best to stabilize him. Finally though, after about 3 hours from the initial incident, the rest of the rescue party finally shows up and begins to get ready to pull Tom out of the pit. Among them was another man experienced in cave rescue by the name of Dennis Curry, who then also rappelled down to help hoist Tom out of the massive hole. Because of his injuries though, they had to raise him up extremely slowly, almost 1 inch a minute, as to keep him as level as possible. And they also had Dennis climb slowly side by side with him as to provide extra safety. When the stretcher made it to the incredibly tight entrance though, they ran into some trouble. So very carefully, Dennis got underneath the stretcher and they managed to maneuver Tom upright, and luckily he was skinny enough to be able to squeeze through. Almost 6 hours after the incident, Tom was then flown to Erlanger Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, about 48 miles or 77 kilometers to the north of the cave, in order to get him the best medical attention possible. When they got there, they concluded that Tom suffered a crushed vertebrae in his spine, which was partially paralyzing him from the waist down. Tom was then hospitalized for about 2 weeks, with several weeks of therapy ahead of him, but miraculously, on December 2nd, 1990, 6 weeks after the incident, he was able to take his first steps, with a lot of his friends and family in his corner to help him get back to health. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you had found yourself in Tom's shoes, and you had fallen over 100 feet to the bottom of a cave floor? Or better yet, what would you have done if you weren't with friends and you had fallen completely by yourself? The film which you are about to see is an account of the disaster which befell 2 British photographers and a Russian expedition into the world's deepest cave. Both originally from the UK, cave photographers Robbie Schoen and his photo assistant Jeff Wade, who at the time were living abroad in France and Australia respectively, were both planning a spelunking trip together of a lifetime in what is today the world's deepest cave system, the Veryovkina Cave. The system itself is located in the Georgian breakaway region of Abkhazia, and with an incredible depth of about 7,257 feet, or 2,212 meters, it is considered the world's deepest cave system. The system is also incredibly complex, with thousands of feet of sheer drops which only the most experienced spelunkers and adventurers could actually traverse. Well, both of our friends decided that if they were going to conquer this behemoth of an adventure that lay ahead of them, that they were going to need some help. And so they decided to join a group of Russians who are all members of the Bravo Spelo caving team, an official group of world-class cavers from Moscow who themselves have been pushing many of the explorations to Veryovkina and the other 4 incredibly deep cave systems around the mountain range. These members included Pavel Demidov, Petr Lyubimov, Konstantin Zverev, Andrei Shuvalov, Yevgeny Rubika, Andrei Ziznikov, Andrei Siskov, Roman Zverev, and Natalia Sizakova, And the team just recently made an incredible achievement by reaching a terminal slump at the water table, being able to reach the incredible depth of about 7,257 feet or 2,212 meters, which by this time was now a new low point record in the caving community, knocking the Cabrera Cave at 7,208 feet or 2,197 meters into second place. And now in September of 2018, the team were planning on exploring a number of promising horizontal leads at the bottom of Veryovkina cave system. They wanted to collect samples of rare and possibly new species of shrimp and scorpions, and also wanted to leverage Robbie's photographic skills to help them document the entire cave, including the beautiful terminals. As the team was traversing the system, it would end up taking them 4 days to completely descend to the bottom of the cave. All the while, the spelunkers had traversed down thousands of feet of ropes and shear drops, crawled through water and mud, choked siphons, and squeezed themselves in all their heavy gear through some of the most torturous and improbable cracks that the cave had to offer. The team would then set up camp at about the 2,200 meter mark, which to their benefit was a flat sandy spot in a horizontal tunnel. The team would then end up spending 3 full days at this depth, as they would end up launching multiple explorations into the new corridors, taking pictures and collecting invertebrate specimens. Later on, both Roman and Natalia would end up leaving early in order to catch a flight back home to Russia, leaving the other 9 to explore alone. Though on the way out, as they reached the camp at about the 1,300 meter mark, they would begin to panic a bit as they both saw a flood pulse. Knowing the danger that this would spell out for their friends below, they both rushed over to the cable wire that they had set up earlier in case of emergency, set their phones up, and were able to call their friends below to warn them. The team had already been inside the system for about a total of 7 days, and so by this time they were already pre-exhausted and just trying to conserve their energy for the climb all the way back up. At first though, the team below wasn't too concerned about it, as flood pulses in this cave system are a lot more common than one might think. Usually heavy rain can cause a huge pool to form, which then suddenly bursts through the cave opening, which then the ensuing flood pulse can then last a few minutes or even hours, but then eventually will subside. The team also wasn't too worried, especially because their campsite was safely adjacent to the main vertical shaft that was actually spewing out the massive amounts of water at this point. And for the most part, everyone was staying dry, so they all felt confident in their own safety. But just then, one of the Russian team members, Petr, noticed a rather loud gurgling sound coming from a small hole in the ground near the tent. He couldn't see any water coming out of the hole yet, though at this time the flood pulse had been raging for over 2 hours with no signs of stopping, so to them it warranted enough of a concern. They then checked a nearby siphon in hopes that the water table hadn't risen yet since the last time they checked. Everything seemed fine at first, but then not even 5 minutes later, after they got back to the campsite, Petr went back to look down the small hole near the tent, and unfortunately this time he saw water rising up so fast that it started bouncing off the cave walls. And just then Petr turned around to the others with his face as though he just had seen a ghost, leading Robbie to think that they couldn't wait any longer and that they all had to go, otherwise they would end up dying very horrible deaths over a mile into the earth. Originally they weren't planning on going anywhere that day, but immediately everyone started scrambling for their gear. All the while, floodwaters continued to rip through the main chasm, the roar of it sounding like a freight train. Then, in a split decision without hesitation, Robbie decided to leave all his camera and personal gear behind, literally tens of thousands of dollars in equipment. He knew though that they had at least a half a mile of intense climbing ahead of them before they could get into any safety, so he left it all behind. Though out of everything, he made sure to grab his camera's flashcards, as they contained the only pictures ever taken of Veryovkina's terminals. So he placed them in a Ziploc bag and slipped them into his latex suit. Then suddenly, Jeff was nowhere to be seen in all the chaos that was ensuing. So Robbie would then yell out in panic, "Jeff, come on! Jeff, we have to leave now! I'm on my way, I'm coming!" Jeff would yell back through the thunderous stream coming down. And then Jeff turned to Petr and said, "We're going! We gotta get out of here now!" "Go," Petr said. "I'll wait for Pavel and the others." That was then the last interaction that Robbie and Jeff would have with the Russian at the low camp, and the two were off. As the two were heading up, they reached a precarious traverse, which before was above an airy shaft about 8 meters wide and 20 meters deep. Well, now that shaft was completely filled with water. Luckily though, they were able to traverse it with little trouble. They then reached the vertical ropes that would be one of their more challenging climbs. He looked up, saw a raging waterfall pouring over them. They then looked at each other, took a deep breath, clipped their ascenders on the rope, put their heads down, and began their climb. The incredible weight of the water absolutely beating them both. It barreled down with such crushing, intense, suffocating force. It felt as though my head was being crushed into my shoulders. He then tucked his chin into his chest and was able to breathe from an air pocket formed by the space created beneath his helmet brim. And luckily, being able to move as fast as he could, using a technique he learned when he was a window washer, pushing a mechanical ascender up the rope, transitioning past belays and knots. All I could see was a white rope in front of me, Robbie thought to himself. And I just kept moving the ascender up a little bit at a time, thinking to myself, just keep going, just keep doing this. Just then, Robbie was able to reach an area where he could step to the side of the turret. He then looked up to see where the rope was running, which it led to a body-sized chimney of rock through which the floodwater was being furiously pumped through. Robbie then just sat there and thought to himself, "You're joking. I physically can't get through that. Where am I supposed to go now?" As unfortunately, there was no airspace or literally anything to get by. But Robbie knew that as lead man, they hadn't climbed high enough to be to safety yet. And he knew that everyone would shortly be coming up behind him, so he had to keep climbing no matter what. So Robbie started to climb into the narrow shaft, forcing his way up all the while. The water that was pouring over him was so punishing, he was only able to push his ascenders up only a few inches up at a time, only being able to take short sips of air as he ascended up. All the while thinking to himself, I really hope everyone else is able to climb through this as well, knowing almost how impossible it was. Then Robbie kept climbing as fast and as high as he could. After a bit, he was able to climb to a relatively dry area where luckily the flood had taken a different direction. And luckily, that was when Jeff was able to call to Robbie from below. Robbie, slow down. We're safe for now, just slow down," Jeff would yell angrily. That's when Robbie reached an anchor and decided to wait for Jeff there. By the time Jeff reached him, Robbie noticed how Jeff's face was pale white and that his eyes were massively open wide, and all he had to say was, "Bloody hell, we're still alive." Then they realized the same might not be able to be said about their Russian friends who were still below. Though luckily, the two of them were then able to climb to the camp at about the 1900 meter mark, where the team still had a tent up that was stacked with food and medical supplies for when the team was on the climb back up. All the while, the rumble of the flood continued to vibrate the floor beneath them. Then, after a few minutes had passed, both Robbie and Jess decided to peer over the ledge into the dark abyss down below, and with sheer luck was able to see a single headlamp appear through the surging waters around it. It was Andrei Ziznikov, but he was alone, and as soon as he reached the camp, Robbie asked whether or not he had seen the others, but unfortunately, he had not seen them. The three then just sat there and prayed, all three of them hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Though almost like a scene from a movie, about 15 minutes later, more headlamps began to appear through the raging waters. One by one, each of the remaining 5 Russians were able to make it to the camp. "I couldn't believe it," Robbie said. "These guys were so strong and capable." One of them had even carried up a pack with 4 sleeping bags, a stove, and a brew kit, though in all reality, the Russians had only escaped by a small hair, as when Pavel had just returned from checking the siphon after the gurgling in the small hole. And right after Robbie and Jeff had left, their chamber was rushed with flood water and they had to swim to even get to the ropes to climb to safety. On top of that, Pavel actually got caught in an eddy that sent him spinning like he was going down a drain, though luckily he was able to fight the current and swim as hard as he could to reach the ropes. The team, now reunited, would spend the next 16 hours at the camp. Though the Russians, being more experienced spelunkers, were all relaxed and laughing with each other over the experience. Though unfortunately for Robbie, he was still pretty freaked out about the whole thing, as he kept his caving gear on the whole time, couldn't sleep, and kept peering over the ledge into the dark abyss below to see if any of the water was rising to their location. All the while, the entire time, the flood would continue through the entire night. And though really his main concern was about a pseudo-siphon about 70 meters or 229 feet above their heads. The long horizontal tunnel was normally half filled with water, and under normal conditions, the only way through was to crawl. Now meaning that with this flood, it was now impossible, and that they were now trapped as long as the flood waters were still coming. Fortunately though, after a few hours of pacing, Robbie was able to relax and even strip down to get comfortable. That's when Pavel would tell Robbie, let's just give it until morning, and he was right. Robbie remembers hearing the water get less and less powerful until almost nothing, all by morning. The flood pulse had ultimately lasted an incredible 20 hours straight from the result of a week straight of raining. And unfortunately, the Russians were under the impression that Veryovkina only flooded during the winter, which wasn't true as they all knew now. And fortunately, despite the flood cutting the trip short by a day, their trip was a complete success, as they were still able to map new passageways, take back several cave invertebrates back for analysis, and a number of climbs were completed to check potential high-level passageways, which was really only them scratching the surface as to what this system might actually hold. Only a couple hours later, Pavel and a couple of the other guys decided to go back for everyone's stuff that was left behind. And unfortunately, Robbie's camera was completely destroyed, and one of Robbie's lights was smashed against the roof of the cave, of which they decided to leave it there, creating a signal and perhaps hopefully letting future spelunkers know how high flood waters can actually rise in this deadly cave system. The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell an amateur cave explorer in Kentucky. Originally from Oak Forest, Illinois, 27-year-old William J. Coughlin was your typical avid outdoorsman who normally takes part in lots of hiking and camping. Well, that was until one of his friends introduced William to the insane sport of amateur spelunking. The first cave that they discovered was just a small local structure without too many corridors, making it the perfect beginner's cave to explore. Though being the adventurers that he and his friends were, they all decided that they were going to need more of a challenging system to test their abilities. And so after a few weeks of searching, finally on May 28, 1993, their quest brought them to a spelunker tourist attraction known as Cave City. Located in west central Kentucky, this small town is also home to the infamous Mammoth Cave National Park, which also has multiple cave systems, one of which is considered the world's longest cave system, which stretches an incredible 420 miles of surveyed passageways and corridors, and is also the site of one of America's most infamous cave rescues and deaths of the 20th century, the Floyd Collins tragedy. And so on the 28th of May, William and two of his friends, Kevin Feely and James Chikala, all made the almost 6-hour trip south to Kentucky and never looked back. And as soon as they arrived to the park, they checked into their hotel and immediately went to the tourist center in town to see which cave they wanted to tackle first. And after a few minutes of deliberation, they all decided that a smaller system known as Buzzard Roost Cave would be the best fit to conquer first. The cave itself has two different tours that are offered, one that's named the Wild Tour and the other the Historic Tour. The Historic one provides a guided tour through safe and mapped out passageways that's more for beginners. And while the Wild Tour is also a guided one, this tour goes through more of the unmapped areas and corridors that are more known for its claustrophobic inducing tight passageways, but also for its less maintained areas as well. And so after a few more moments of conferring with each other, they all decided on taking the Historic Tour first, mainly because it was the next tour to explore the cave and our friends were eager to get started. And so after the group was forced to sign a release form, William and James would decide to stay on the tour that they had just signed up for, while Kevin decided to stay in the visitor center and would perhaps wait to join a tour later when he felt more up to it. Meanwhile, after William and James completed the Historic Tour, the park already had the Wild Tour getting ready to go. And with their adrenaline still pumped, William and James opted to join this tour as well. And so after having to fill out another release form, the two joined a group of 4 other spelunkers and a tour guide, who then made sure to inform the group exactly of what lay ahead and how difficult it actually was going to be. And with that, the guide handed everyone an extra handheld flashlight, told them to stay close, and headed off. As the group were starting to navigate their way through the tight and winding passageways, our two friends, William and James, would be having the time of their lives, as they were finally having a once-in-a-lifetime experience by conquering their first advanced cave system. Then, as the group made their way past the midway mark, the guide would also make sure to take this time to inform the group that they were now going to start their descent down to the more difficult parts of the system that were considered more claustrophobic inducing, as well as how they were going to be coming up on a 30-foot rope ladder that was held in place by thin wooden beams, as well as a second ladder that's about 20 feet that's a little further down the system, and made sure to let them know of the dangers that now truly lie ahead of them. As the group started their second descent, William would start to notice that every so often, he would become stuck on some surrounding rocks, though luckily it was nothing ever too terror-inducing, as he was always able to pull himself free after only a few seconds of actually being stuck. Then once the group was able to finally descend down the second ladder, and the group made it down to the bottom, the tour guide then told the group that they were free to explore, but to stay close. That way nothing bad happened to them, as he used his satellite phone to make a quick call back to his colleagues up top. Unfortunately though, once the guide's back was turned, our friends would decide to make the worst decision of their entire lives. Their plan was going to be to sneak back up to the second ladder and try to explore a dark passageway that William had seen earlier. And so, thinking that they would only be gone for a few minutes or so, the two set off. As the two made it back to the ladder, William would be the first to try to climb back up. Though as he would begin to try, the combination of his weight and weakness of the rope itself would make William's descent back to the first rope a rather difficult one, to say the least. And unfortunately, no one in the group were really prepared either, as no one brought any helmets, water, food, or specialized climbing gear to help them back up. And so as William was continuing to struggle up the rope ladder, he would begin to sway back and forth, eventually causing him to lose his grip and fall about 10 feet or so. And unfortunately, as this happened, he would hit his head on multiple rocks on the way down, and then again as he hit the hard cave floor. Then once he was able to snap out of his disbelief, James called out to William and ran by his side in order to try to stop the bleeding from his head wound. Then as blood started to pool around William's head, James couldn't help but to just stare in unbelievable awe as he just witnessed the entire thing. Then as James began to care for William's head wound, he began to ask him questions as William was still conscious. Though as James asked more and more questions, he would quickly learn that William had most likely suffered from a concussion, as he was no longer coherent or making sense as well. As well as he also noticed that William's eyes weren't really responding to the light that was being periodically flashed. Though after a few minutes would pass by, William would once again regain his motor skills, and shortly after would begin to panic as he slowly realized his situation that he now found himself in. Then, as James tried his best to comfort his friend, the tour guide and 4 other spelunkers would finally make their way towards the ladders and see the severity of what just happened. And immediately thinking of the difficult climb back up that they were already going to have before this accident, the tour guide then took control and informed everyone in the group that they would all have to work together as a team if they had any chance of successfully exiting the cave. Though knowing that his friend was at least 6 foot tall and 200 pounds and still going in and out of consciousness, James would argue that they should at least try to use the satellite phone and try to call for outside help. But then the tour guide tried to argue that he didn't believe that William would last that long due to his profusive bleeding, and that if he had any chance of survival, that they needed to act now. Though in all honesty, James really believed that he didn't really want to make the call because the tour guide didn't want to cause a fuss back up top. But not knowing what else to do, he agreed and the group got ready. Then working as a team, they were able to get William slowly but surely not only back up the second rope ladder, but also the first one as well, making it all the way back up to the midway point. Then celebrating, the group was excited and thinking that they were past the actual difficult part in their ascent back up to the top. And unfortunately, they all failed to remember the insanely tight and winding corridors that they now had to somehow squeeze William's large frame through. Though William was now coherent enough to at least slowly crawl on his own through the passageways. As he was crawling his way through, the group made sure to keep one person in front and behind him at all times just in case. And miraculously, he was able to crawl a lot better than they thought as he navigated his way back up. Well, at least that was until William found himself as a passageway that would have him crawling at a downward angle. And as he crawled his way through, the group would eventually hear their teammate that was directly behind William call out for help. As unfortunately for William, he had become lodged between the cave wall and several sharp and jagged rocks that were now protruding on the opposite wall. And to make things worse, he was stuck upside down and was beginning to feel the unforgiving force of gravity pushing him further down, which unfortunately for William, was only lodging him further into a trapped position. And to further exacerbate the situation, William would also begin to bleed profusely from the wound on his head. There was also not much William could do to help himself get free, because horrifically, as William got stuck, he managed to pin both his arms in place, one behind his back and the other under his stomach. Then the group tried pulling and simultaneously pushing his body through, which horribly only lodged his body further, making a bad situation even worse. Then as James would begin pushing William's legs with all his might, he would end up pushing William further into what was already a very tight passageway, which unfortunately then made his breathing near impossible, which then plunged him into a complete claustrophobic nightmare. Then finally, with no other option available, it would be at this time that the tour guide would finally give in and call his supervisor back up top, so that way they could save William before it was too late. The supervisor then, as fast as possible, called the local police station, who then immediately sent out a quick response rescue team. Then as the team made its way towards William, they began to work diligently, though in all reality, things were not looking so optimistic, as William's blood was all rushing towards his head, causing his vision to start to blur, and his state of consciousness to become incredibly confused, until eventually William lost all consciousness, which horrifically is an almost guaranteed death sentence in a situation like this, as William was no longer able to help, all while his body continued to become uncontrollably cold as his blood continued to pool towards his head. Then, knowing that the chance of an actual rescue had all but slipped through their fingers, the rescue team called down for some blankets in order to keep him warmer as time went on in this cold, dank cave. And by this time, most of the group, except for James, had been escorted out through a secondary passageway. James had made the conscious decision to stay with his friend until the rescue team had told James that he had no other choice but to leave. Then finally, as a last resort, the rescue team decided they would strap William up to a pulley system and try to yank him out this way. As they hooked him up and began pulling on him, William would then begin to involuntarily groan and make gurgling noises as his body was beginning to get stretched and contorted. Not to mention the insanely sharp rocks that were lodged between his chest and stomach were also starting to rip at his skin underneath. Then tragically, almost 23 hours after initially entering the cave and 17 hours after the rescue team had initially arrived, William, at the young age of 27, passed away, and eventually had to wait on an additional 3 days before his body could properly be retrieved. And as his body was brought to the morgue, it was determined that his death was caused by compressive and positional asphyxia, which essentially meant he was upside down and in a narrow passageway. He eventually lost the ability to breathe properly on his own. Investigators also later came to their own conclusion that the owner of the park was liable, and that the release that the boys had signed earlier did not specify the exact dangers that they could have gotten themselves into, which ultimately resulted in Williams' family suing the park and winning an undisclosed amount in restitution. And with that being said, may William J. Coughlin rest in peace. And once again, thank you for watching. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.